Okay? They all do. And some people pick and choose what parts of the Constitution that they want to talk about. But you see, when we have people that stand up and all they do is, it's real important, it's good. It's good when somebody draws attention to the Constitution. It's good. But what's really, really important is not necessarily just the words in the Constitution, because, the Bible makes mention of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Okay? That means that the letter of the law has to have some kind of underlying guiding principles. There has to be a reason that the letter of the law says what it says. And the reason it says what it says is because there's a principle that somebody had in mind when they penned it, when they wrote it. So when you want to defend the liberty, it's really hard to defend the liberty just from the sole perspective of the letter of the law. It's really hard. But when you bring into account the principles behind it, when you bring into the spirit of the law, Thomas Jefferson once said, I'm going to butcher this quote, but he said, instead of inventing what kind of words might be squeezed out of the text, recollect the spirit, manifest the spirit in which the text was penned in the first place. Thomas Jefferson was saying it's not just about the text, because that can be reworded over and over and over again. We see our courts do it, right? Courts do it all the time. The courts are probably the worst. They're the most famous for doing it. But Jefferson warned us to not just look at just the text, but he said we need to look at and manifest the spirit of the text. We need to recollect the debates that our founding fathers were engaged in when they were trying to figure out exactly what they should write and how they should write it. Perfect example of this is the Second Amendment. A lot of people don't know that the Second Amendment was the most debated amendment when our founding fathers were debating the Bill of Rights. And the reason it was the most debated, it's not because, some people would have you think it's because some of them were for gun control. Okay? But that wasn't the case. The reason it was the most debated of all the amendments is because they wanted to make sure that they so carefully crafted those words to make sure that government could never construe or deny the right of the people to keep and bear arms. That's why it was the most debated. There's a couple other things in the debate, too. For example, here's an interesting fact. Did you know that the Second Amendment, the original first few drafts, had conscription, or in other words, military draft? It provided constitutionally a mechanism for the United States government to draft people into the military. I think it's really interesting that our founding fathers were kind of torn on the issue, but they finally decided against it on this one principle. They said that we don't want to start this country off with the idea that the government owns the people, that the government can pull people into certain roles. Now, this isn't to talk about drafts. This isn't to talk about wars. This is to talk about principles. Okay, so it's important to think about these principles. It's important to think about what our founding fathers thought about issues like that. And as far as an issue like that goes, like I mentioned earlier, I've met many of you in here. Some of you I meet for the first time tonight. Thanks for coming. And I've spent 4 years on active duty in the United States Marine Corps. I was an infantryman. This was my helmet. This is the helmet that I wore. This is a Kevlar helmet. It says right here, Corporal CURTMAN. This was before I got promoted to sergeant. 2nd Battalion, Golf Company, 3rd Platoon. On the other side, just so y'all get a little peek into the past of Paul CURTMAN here, my call sign, I got my blood type written right here, A positive. Go ahead and write our blood type on our helmets. And right here, I have my call sign. This is how people recognized me and called me up on the radio, Choir Boy. That was my call sign. Right underneath Choir Boy, I put a couple little music notes. It's kind of my little logo there. But and some of you have heard of different parts of this talk before, okay? And I'm hoping to get to the point where all people can almost start saying it with me, all right? Because I don't think that there's enough people that understand some of the things that we understand and that I understand in America, which is, I think, directly evident by the shape that America's in right now. But I spent several years in the United States Marine Corps, and it's a shame to say that when I left the Marine Corps, when I left active duty at least as a sergeant, if somebody would have asked me, well, you spent all this time fighting for our freedom, so tell me, Sergeant CURTMAN, what does freedom mean? What does liberty mean? I mean, you put your life on the line for it. What do you have to say about it? I'm ashamed and embarrassed to tell you that as a sergeant in the Marine Corps who did a couple tours overseas, I couldn't give you a good answer. I could not give you a good answer. I grew up in a great family. I went to public school, but I think that I grew up in a culture that continually suppresses the ability for young people to begin to think on their own and question things, and to be able to kind of decipher some of these principles. So right about 2004, I heard John Kerry say I was for the war before I was against the war, right? Now, for the sake of fairness, though, it wasn't just Democrats saying that. It was Republicans saying it too, right? Because 2004, a very, very politicized issue the wars were, right? And suddenly people were deciding, well, I was, but now I'm not, or they just don't want to talk about it. But when I heard John Kerry say that, I immediately got a little bit angry with him, okay? Because I'm thinking to myself, I had a couple of friends in my squad that went back overseas, and they didn't make it home. And so I'm thinking to myself, how dare somebody who voted for all these issues, all these actions, to suddenly decide that they're just not for it anymore, because I know that my two friends that lost their lives did not have the luxury of deciding whether or not they were for or against going on patrol that morning. And so I started becoming a little bit more sensitive to things going on in government, so I went back and I read the Constitution. I figured I might as well. I took an oath to it. Right? Might be a good idea for a lot of other people to kind of come to the same conclusion. Things really begin to make sense. They begin to make sense. Separation of powers, checks and balances. I get it. Our founding fathers gave us a great constitution to help us keep government limited so people could stay free. But see, at this point, though, I was only trying to reckon the letter of the law. I only understood the letter of the law. Okay? And so I was in this place in my life where I knew what I believed. I just didn't know why I believed it. And the reason I didn't know why I believed the Constitution has all the right answers was because I didn't do what Jefferson said. I didn't manifest the spirit in which the Constitution was written in the first place. In order to do that, you have to go back further in time and read the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is just nothing but the spirit of the laws, the spirit of governments. That's why we have government in America. It even says in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, here's why you have government. And so if you want to, I like to tell people, if you have a candidate that comes to you and they're trying to get you to give them their vote, you want to see their head explode, just ask them to give you their job description. Okay, well, what's your job description? Like, what would you do if you were elected? And most likely, you're going to hear people just begin this whole dissertation about economics, this whole long dissertation about security, or this long, drawn-out answer that ultimately they wind up not answering anything. Okay? But the thing is that all the answers are in the spirit of the law. All the answers are in the Declaration of Independence. And I do this every chance I get an opportunity to. And I have a few lines of the Declaration of Independence memorized, and I like to speak in school sometimes when I'm there speaking for veterans issues or Veterans Day, for example. I like to say this to the kids, and I encourage the kids to learn this too. Okay? It took Thomas Jefferson over 2 weeks to write just this one phrase, okay, because we wanted to make sure he got it right. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Now, what I love about that is because what they were declaring independence from was a form of government in which people weren't created equal. They were declaring independence from a form of government in which the king was the only person that had any rights whatsoever. The king, you ever heard of the theory of the divine right of kings? The people believed and the king believed that God gave him liberty. He was the only person that had any liberty, the only rights to anything. Right? That's what they believed, the divine right of kings. And so I love this part where our founding fathers said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Because it's kind of like slapping him in the face and saying, "Wise up, man. We figured it out and we're on to you. We're all created equal." So, God didn't just give you freedom and liberty. God gave all of us freedom and liberty. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Saying it's self-evident, by saying it's self-evident, it's like they're saying, and we feel stupid for not sending you this letter sooner. Okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then they were so wise to make sure that they said among these rights. Because our founding fathers, they weren't going to list all of our rights. Because they knew that at some point, somebody in government might decide that the government was the one that gave you the rights, since we listed them all, right? So Thomas Jefferson said, "And among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And that to secure these rights, this is why we have government. This is the spirit of the law. This is my job description as a state representative. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So what's my job description? What is the role of a congressman or speaker of the House or a United States senator or the president or even a judge at the Supreme Court level? What is the role of government? To secure your rights. To keep you free. That's it. 3 words or less. I'll tell you what, when I was I was making sandwiches at Hardee's when I was 16 years old, my job description was a lot longer than that. Okay? In fact, here's another little peek into my past. When I was 14 years old, I got a worker's permit. My first job, I dressed up as a gorilla. And I stood out in front of a fireworks store to wave people in. I was like their attraction. Okay? Now, even that job has had the job description was longer than 3 words. But you see, in America, to defend liberty, all people have to know is that the reason we have government in the first place is just to defend our rights and to keep us free. But here's where we get into trouble. We have people that don't understand what liberty means. They're like me when I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps. If you go up to somebody, a politician today, or basically any average person on the street, and you ask them, what is liberty, what is freedom, they'll probably give you a very, very, very shallow answer. A lot of people think, and John Bruner mentioned this before, and I think Speaker Jones mentioned this also, a lot of people, if you ask them what freedom is, they believe that they have freedom because they believe they have freedom because they have a choice. They have 2 choices, so they have freedom. I went and spoke at a high school just to kind of talk about some of this issue long before I was ever elected. And I asked the students, I said, I've never talked to students before. I've never spoken to students, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions just to kind of gauge where you're at so I know how to talk. I said, can anybody here give me a good definition of liberty or freedom? One or the other? And then there's a difference. And first they all looked at me like, who asked that? You know, what kind of question is this? But then one of them finally spoke up and said, well, it's just doing whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it, right? But we just heard from John Bruner that doing whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it isn't necessarily freedom, right? It's more along the lines of anarchy. And at some point in time, you have to introduce morality into the equation. You have to. And George Washington had some words to say about that, and I'm actually going to get to that here in just a few minutes. But liberty is self-evident. It really is self-evident. The best illustration that I've ever been able to use, some of you have heard this before, the best illustration, you don't need anybody to tell you what your freedom and liberty is because it's self-evident. It's written in, John Adams referred to God as the great legislator of the universe, okay? This stuff is written, there's absolutes. A lot of people say there's no such thing as absolutes. There are absolutes. Anybody who says that there's no absolutes, they're not paying attention to anything. There's grammatical absolutes. I actually did this in university. I got into this discussion. I was under a panel discussion. And the class was trying to convince me that there was no such thing as absolutes. So I looked at the grammar teacher. I said, are there grammatical absolutes? She said, yep. I said, well, there's one. I said, are there mathematical